Imagine tying the knot in medieval times only to find out your marriage could be wiped from existence because your great-great-grand uncle married your spouse's great-great-grand aunt. Or picture this: if you couldn't perform on your wedding night, and for a while after, your "I do" could become an "I don't think so." And get this, a secret promise whispered to a former flame years ago could suddenly pop up and declare your current, very public marriage totally void. Medieval love lives were a minefield of rules that could, and often did, bring marriages to a screeching halt for reasons that seem wild to us today. Forget conscious uncoupling. This was more like, oops, it never even counted. Number 10. Too close for comfort, consanguinity and affinity. Ever heard the phrase, kissing cousins? Well, in the medieval period, the definition of cousin you couldn't marry stretched way further than you might think. This whole area was covered by two main ideas, consanguinity and affinity. Consanguinity means being related by blood. Think: parents, children, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. Pretty straightforward, right? Not so fast. For a long time in the early medieval period, the Church forbade marriage out to the 7th degree of kinship. Now, figuring out degrees of kinship isn't like counting on your fingers. It involved going up to the common ancestor and then back down. The 7th degree meant people sharing a great-great-great-great-grandparent were off limits. Imagine trying to trace your family tree back that far, with the kind of record-keeping they had. It was a genealogical maze. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, this was relaxed to the 4th degree, sharing a great-great-grandparent, which was still pretty extensive. Why so strict? The Church had its reasons. There were concerns about spiritual purity, and some scriptural interpretations were used to back this up. Also, in a society where land and power were everything, keeping powerful families from becoming too intertwined and consolidating too much might have been an unstated background factor for some. For many ordinary folks, though, especially in small isolated villages, finding an eligible spouse who wasn't related within these forbidden degrees could be a genuine challenge. Then there was affinity. This was relationship by marriage. So, you couldn't marry your deceased spouse's blood relatives to the same degree you couldn't marry your own. If your husband died, you couldn't marry his brother, his cousin, or even his distant cousin out to the forbidden degree. It also extended to your spouse's relatives by their previous marriages. It created a web of connections that could trip up any marriage. And it didn't stop there. There was also spiritual affinity. This arose from baptism or confirmation. A godparent couldn't marry their godchild, nor could they marry the godchild's parent. The person who stood as sponsor at confirmation also created a spiritual relationship that barred marriage. How did these rules lead to marriage's ending? If it was discovered or alleged that a couple was related within the forbidden degrees of consanguinity or affinity after they had married, their marriage could be declared null. It meant, in the eyes of the Church, that the marriage had never truly existed. This became a very convenient way for powerful people to get out of marriages they no longer wanted. King Louis VII of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous power couples of the age, had their marriage annulled in 1152 after 15 years, and 2 daughters, officially on the grounds of consanguinity. They were third cousins once removed, or something similarly close by today's standards, but within the rules then for some. The real reasons were likely political and personal incompatibility, but consanguinity was the legal ticket out. For ordinary people, a genuine discovery of a too close relationship could lead to heartbreak and social upheaval, as their union and any children from it were suddenly delegitimized. Proving or disproving these claims often involved complex testimonies from elderly community members who could remember family trees. Sometimes, dispensations could be bought or granted, especially if you were rich or powerful, allowing a marriage within the forbidden degrees to go ahead or be regularized. But without one, if the connection was proven, the marriage was over. Number 9. Pre-contract or prior marriage. Imagine this. You're happily married, years into your life together, maybe with kids. Then, someone pops up claiming your spouse, secretly, promised to marry them long before they ever met you. And in medieval times, that could be enough to unravel your entire world. This was the issue of a pre-contract, or a prior valid marriage. The Church taught that the core of a valid marriage was the free consent of both parties. This consent could be expressed in 2 ways. Verba de presenti, words of present consent, like, I take you as my wife, husband, right now. Or verba de purturu, words of future consent, I promise I will marry you. If verba de presenti were exchanged between 2 free and eligible people, even in private, without witnesses or a priest, the Church considered it a valid, though illicit, meaning against the rules of public ceremony, marriage. If verba de purturu were exchanged and then followed by physical consummation, that too was often considered to have become a binding marriage. So what happened if someone exchanged these binding words with one person and then went on to marry someone else in a public church ceremony? The first, private commitment, if proven, trumped the later, public one. The second marriage, no matter how grand or how long it had lasted, would be declared null and void because one of the parties was not free to marry. They were in essence already married. Proving such a pre-contract was, as you can guess, tricky. It often came down to one person's word against another's, or the testimony of secret witnesses, if any. This opened the door for all sorts of complications. Someone might genuinely have forgotten a youthful promise, or never considered it serious. Or, more cynically, a person might falsely claim a pre-contract to break up a marriage they were jealous of, or to get out of their own current unhappy marriage if their spouse was the one with the alleged prior commitment. Courts had to listen to these cases. They'd hear evidence, look for witnesses, and try to determine if a binding promise had indeed been made. If a pre-contract was upheld, the person was legally bound to the individual from that first promise, and their subsequent marriage was dissolved as if it never happened. The children from the second, now nullified, marriage might be declared illegitimate, which had massive social and inheritance implications. Think about the drama. A forgotten youthful indiscretion, a secret vow whispered in a moment of passion, could come back to haunt someone decades later. It created a lot of uncertainty around marriage. People, especially nobles, whose marriages involved huge stakes like alliances and property, were often very careful about who their children associated with and what promises they might be making. Before the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century formerly required marriages to be performed by a priest before witnesses to be valid, which is technically post-medieval but addressed long-standing medieval problems. These clandestine or informally contracted marriages were a persistent source of marital breakdowns. The principle was clear. You couldn't be married to two people at once, and the first valid commitment stuck. Number 8. Not up to the task impotence. In medieval eyes, one of the primary purposes of marriage, alongside companionship and the avoidance of sin, was procreation. Be fruitful and multiply was taken very seriously. Therefore, the physical ability to consummate the marriage was considered absolutely essential for it to be a true and complete union. If one partner was found to be permanently impotent, meaning physically incapable of sexual intercourse, the marriage could be annulled. This wasn't about not wanting children or a low libido. It was about the fundamental physical capacity. The Church distinguished between sterility, being unable to conceive children, which was not grounds for annulment, and impotence, being unable to perform the act of sex itself. Only the latter could invalidate a marriage. The tricky part was proving it. If a wife, for instance, claimed her husband was impotent, how was that determined? It could lead to some rather awkward and often humiliating procedures. The husband might be examined by physicians or midwives. Sometimes, courts ordered the couple to attempt consummation under observation, or with witnesses nearby, which sounds incredibly uncomfortable. There were also trials of Congress, where the couple might be ordered to cohabit for a period, sometimes even 3 years, to see if consummation could be achieved. There was also a peculiar category called impotentia, quod hanc, or quod hunc, for a woman, meaning impotence only with respect to the specific spouse. The idea was that someone might be capable of intercourse generally, but for some specific reason, perhaps psychological or even attributed to witchcraft or a curse, they were incapable with their married partner. If this was proven, it could also be grounds for annulment, and the afflicted person might even be free to marry someone else, with whom they presumably wouldn't have the same issue. Accusations of impotence could be a way out of an unwanted marriage, but they carried a heavy social stigma, especially for men. To defend against such a claim, a man might undergo inspections or even offer to demonstrate his virility with other women, though this was highly controversial and not universally accepted as proof. Sometimes a group of compurgators, often 7 men known as the Septima Manu, would swear an oath testifying to the man's known virility or good character, though this was more about reputation than direct physical evidence. If impotence was established to the court's satisfaction as permanent and existing at the time of the marriage, the union would be declared null. It was considered that a key component of the marriage contract, the physical union, could not be fulfilled, and therefore no true marriage had ever come into being. Both parties would then be free to marry others. This focus on consummation underscored how much medieval marriage was tied, not just to love or companionship, but to very specific physical and sacramental expectations. Number 7. Secret vows and unwilling hearts. Clandestine marriage and lack of consent force. The medieval church was quite clear on one thing. For a marriage to be valid, it absolutely had to be based on the free consent of both the man and the woman. If that consent was missing, or if the marriage was conducted in a way that totally ignored proper procedures, making it clandestine, it could be in big trouble. Let's talk about consent first. If someone was forced into a marriage against their will, perhaps through physical threats, abduction, known as raptus, or extreme unrelenting duress, that marriage wasn't seen as legitimate. The idea was that a vow made under fear or compulsion wasn't a true free vow. So, if you were literally dragged to the altar or married with a sword at your throat, you could later petition to have the marriage annulled on grounds of force. Proving force or lack of consent, however, was often very difficult, especially for women who were generally in a less powerful social position. Family pressure was immense in medieval society, and there was a fine line between strong persuasion or arranged marriages, which were common and accepted, and outright coercion that would nullify the union. Parents often chose spouses for their children for reasons of property, alliance, or social standing, and children were generally expected to obey. It would take pretty extreme evidence of direct force to convince a church court that consent was truly absent. Then there was the issue of clandestine marriages. These were marriages that weren't performed according to the proper public forms, maybe without the bans, public announcements of the intended marriage in church for 3 successive weeks, or not in the presence of a priest and witnesses at the church door. As mentioned earlier, if 2 people privately exchanged vows of present consent, "I marry you," the church often considered this a real, though illicit, irregular, and sinful marriage. The problem with clandestine marriages wasn't always that they were invalid from the start, but that they caused chaos. Without public record or witnesses, it was easy for one party to later deny the marriage, or for someone to enter into a second public marriage while already secretly bound to another. This led to all sorts of legal tangles, bigamy accusations, and questions about the legitimacy of children. If a clandestine marriage could be proven, and one of the parties then married someone else publicly, that public marriage could be overturned in favor of the earlier secret one. So while a clandestine marriage might be considered real in terms of the bond, its secrecy and lack of proper form could lead to it being ended in practical terms if challenged, or if it came into conflict with a subsequent more formal union that one party tried to enter. The church constantly tried to discourage clandestine marriages and push for public ceremonies to avoid these very problems, eventually culminating in the Council of Trent's decree that made priest witnessed public ceremonies essential for validity. Though that's just past the main medieval period, it shows the long-term trajectory of dealing with this issue. For much of the medieval era, though the shadows of secret vows and the possibility of forced consent could cast a long pall over marital stability. Number 6. A higher calling, holy orders or solemn vow. In the medieval world, God and the Church were central to life. For some, this meant a calling so strong that it overrode even the bonds of marriage, or prevented marriage from being possible in the first place. This was the case with holy orders and solemn religious vows. If a man had already been ordained as a deacon, priest, or bishop, meaning he had received the sacrament of holy orders, he was generally barred from marrying. The discipline of celibacy for clergy in major orders became increasingly entrenched in the Western Church throughout the medieval period. So if a man who was already a priest, for example, attempted to marry, that marriage would be considered null and void from the outset. His prior commitment to God and the Church made him incapable of validly contracting a marriage. Similarly, if a man or a woman had taken solemn vows as a monk or a nun in a recognized religious order, vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, they too were considered unable to marry. Their life was dedicated to God in a way that was seen as incompatible with marital duties and commitments. An attempt by a professed monk or nun to marry would be invalid. It wasn't just about vows taken before a marriage attempt. What if someone decided to take holy orders or enter a monastery after they were already married? This was more complex. Generally, a valid consummated marriage could not simply be dissolved by one partner deciding to pursue a religious life without the consent of the other. However, there were situations where couples mutually agreed to separate, so one or both could enter religious life. Sometimes, if one spouse entered a religious order with the, perhaps reluctant, consent of the other, the remaining spouse might be permitted to live as if single, though remarriage was often restricted or forbidden while the religious spouse lived. There are historical accounts of individuals, both men and women, who felt a strong religious calling later in life, even after marrying and having children. The desire to dedicate oneself entirely to God could lead to the end of cohabitation and the practical, if not always canonical, end of the marital relationship as it had been lived. The Church viewed a solemn vow to God as a profound and binding commitment. This wasn't a common way for marriages to end, certainly not as common as issues like consanguinity or impotence, but it was a recognized reality. If someone had a pre-existing overriding commitment to a celibate religious life, whether as ordained clergy or a professed religious, they were simply not considered marriageable material in the eyes of canon law. Any attempted marriage involving such a person was seen as an offense against their sacred vows, and was therefore invalid from the beginning. The call to serve God directly in these specific ways trumped the call to matrimony. Number 5. One of you isn't baptized. Disparity of cult. Marriage in medieval Christendom was viewed as more than just a social contract. It was a sacrament, a sacred institution ordained by God. And for a sacrament to be validly received, generally the participants needed to be part of the Christian community, meaning they needed to be baptized. This led to the impediment known as disparity of cult, or disparitas cultus. In simple terms, disparity of cult meant that a marriage between a baptized Christian and a non-baptized person, such as a Jew, a Muslim, or a pagan, was considered invalid by the Church. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as a fundamental incompatibility that prevented a true sacramental marriage from existing. The reasoning was that the spiritual unity essential for a Christian marriage couldn't exist if one partner was outside the Christian faith. There were also concerns about the religious upbringing of children and the potential danger to the faith of the Christian spouse. This rule had significant implications, especially in regions where different religious communities lived side by side, like parts of Spain, before and during the Reconquista, Sicily, or the Crusader states in the Holy Land. If a Christian man wished to marry a Jewish or Muslim woman, for example, she would typically be required to convert to Christianity and be baptized before the marriage could be considered valid by the Church. Without such a conversion, any attempted union was null. What if someone married a person they thought was Christian, but later discovered they had never been baptized? Or what if one partner in a marriage between two non-baptized people later converted to Christianity, but the other did not? These situations could create complications. If a marriage was discovered to be void due to disparity of cult, it would be annulled. The Privilegium Paulinum, or Pauline privilege, based on St. Paul's writings, allowed for a dissolution of a marriage contracted between two non-baptized people if one converted to Christianity and the non-Christian spouse was unwilling to cohabit. That is, trying to make the Christian renounce their faith or live sinfully. In such a case, the Christian convert might be allowed to remarry. This wasn't usually about ending a long-standing Christian marriage. It was more often about preventing such marriages from being recognized in the first place, or nullifying them if they had been mistakenly entered into. The emphasis was on maintaining the sacramental integrity of marriage within the Christian fold. For people living in largely homogeneous Christian societies in, say, England or France, this impediment might not have come up very often in daily life. But it was a firm part of canon law. The identity of being Christian, confirmed through baptism, was a prerequisite for entering into what the Church defined as a true and valid marriage. If that fundamental condition wasn't met by both parties, the marriage in the eyes of medieval religious authorities simply couldn't stand. Number 4. You're not who I thought you were. Error concerning the person. This one sounds like something out of a mistaken identity comedy, but it was a real, if very rare, ground for annulling a medieval marriage. It's called error concerning the person. Error in persona. This wasn't about discovering your spouse had an annoying habit of snoring, or wasn't as rich as you hoped. This was about a fundamental mistake regarding the actual physical identity of the person you married. Imagine you intended to marry Jane, but through some trickery or genuine mix-up, perhaps involving identical twins in an era before photo ID, you ended up exchanging vows with her sister Mary instead. If you could prove that you intended to marry a specific individual, Jane, and by mistake ended up with a different individual, Mary, the marriage to Mary could be declared null and void. The consent you gave was for Jane, not Mary, so your consent to marry Mary was fundamentally flawed. This was a very narrowly defined impediment. It couldn't be used if you married someone thinking they had great qualities, like kindness or wealth, and then found out they didn't. That was considered error in quality, and it was tough luck your marriage was still valid. You chose that person, even if you were mistaken about their attributes. Error in persona was strictly about marrying person A, when you genuinely intended and believed you were marrying person B. Another related but slightly different category was error as to a quality amounting to an error of person, which sometimes included marrying someone of servile status, a serf or slave, believing them to be free. In a society with rigid social hierarchies, marrying someone of unfree status without knowing it could have serious implications for your own status and that of your children. Some canonists argued that if freedom was a direct and principal intention of the marriage contract for one party, then discovering the spouse was unfree could in some circumstances invalidate the marriage because it was such a fundamental error about who they were in society. This was debated, though, and not as clear-cut as a straightforward mistaken identity. Proving error in persona was naturally very difficult. How do you convince a court you genuinely thought the woman beside you at the altar was her sister? It would require extraordinary circumstances and compelling evidence. Because it was so rare and hard to prove, it wasn't a common way for marriages to end. However, its existence highlights how seriously the Church took the concept of informed consent to the specific individual. If that consent was misdirected due to a genuine mistake about who the other person physically was, then no true marital bond could be formed. So while most medieval folks didn't have to worry about accidentally marrying their intended's identical twin in a cunning switcheroo, the law did provide this highly specific escape hatch for situations where a mistake about the very identity of one's spouse had occurred. It underscored that you had to know and consent to marry the actual human being you were marrying, not just a name or an idea of a person. Number 3. cruel and unusual punishment, extreme cruelty or abuse. Life in medieval times could be harsh, and unfortunately, this harshness sometimes extended into marriage. While the Church strongly upheld the permanence of marriage, it also recognized that there were situations where forcing a couple to live together was not only unbearable, but also dangerous. This is where the concept of separation from bed and board, divortium a mensa et thoro, due to extreme cruelty or abuse came in. It's important to understand that this was not an annulment. An annulment meant the marriage was declared null, as if it never existed, and both parties were free to remarry. A separation from bed and board, however, meant the marriage bond itself remained intact. The couple was still technically married in the eyes of God and the Church, but they were granted permission to live apart. Remarriage was not allowed for either spouse, as long as the other lived. What constituted extreme cruelty sufficient to grant such a separation? Generally, it had to be severe and life-threatening. Physical violence that put one spouse, usually the wife, though theoretically it could apply to husbands too, in genuine danger was the primary ground. Mere unhappiness, incompatibility, or minor squabbles were not enough. The church courts were looking for evidence of sevitia, cruelty, that made continued cohabitation perilous. This could include repeated beatings, serious threats, or behavior that endangered the soul, like forcing a spouse into heretical practices, though this was rarer. Obtaining a separation on grounds of cruelty was often a difficult process, particularly for women who had fewer legal and social resources. They would need to bring their case before an ecclesiastical court and provide evidence which might include testimony from witnesses who had seen the abuse or its effects. Given the patriarchal nature of medieval society, where husbands were generally considered the head of the household with rights to discipline their wives within certain, often ill-defined limits, proving that the husband's actions crossed the line into unacceptable cruelty could be challenging. However, these separations did happen. When granted, it offered a measure of protection to the abused spouse. They were no longer legally required to live with their abuser. Arrangements might be made for financial support, alimony in a sense, though this was often difficult to enforce. While not a complete ending in the modern sense of divorce, allowing remarriage, a separation from bed and board, effectively terminated the shared life of the couple. They lived separate lives, managed separate households if they could afford to, and their marital relationship, in terms of cohabitation and mutual daily life, was over. For the person suffering extreme abuse, this separation, even without the possibility of remarriage, could be a vital lifeline, an end to a period of terror and suffering within the marriage. It was the Church's way of acknowledging that while the marriage bond was sacred and indissoluble, the safety and well-being of individuals also had to be considered. Number 2. Wandering eyes and broken vows, adultery. Adultery was considered a very serious sin in medieval society, a grave violation of the marriage vows and a threat to the stability of the family and social order. While it was seen as a profound betrayal, its consequences in terms of ending a marriage were, like cruelty, generally limited to a separation from bed and board, divortium a mensa et thoro, not a full annulment that would allow the innocent party to remarry. The Church taught that adultery, while a terrible sin, did not break the sacramental bond of marriage itself, which was considered indissoluble. However, it could make continued cohabitation intolerable or scandalous. If one spouse committed adultery, the innocent spouse could petition an ecclesiastical court for a separation. If granted, they would be permitted to live apart, but as with separations for cruelty, they remained married and could not remarry while their adulterous spouse was alive. There was often a significant double standard in how adultery was viewed and punished. While adultery by either spouse was a sin, wifely adultery was frequently treated with greater severity in social and legal terms. This was largely due to concerns about patrilineal inheritance. If a wife had an affair, it cast doubt on the legitimacy of her children and, therefore, on who would inherit the husband's property, titles, and name. A husband's adultery, while still sinful, didn't typically carry the same direct threat to the recognized lineage. Proving adultery in court could be difficult. It often required eyewitness testimony to the act itself, which was rare, or very strong circumstantial evidence. A confession from the guilty party would also suffice. Public accusations of adultery could lead to intense social shame and scandal for everyone involved. Punishments for adultery varied by region and social status but could include public penance, fines, flogging, or even banishment for the guilty party. If a separation was granted on the grounds of adultery, the innocent spouse was no longer obliged to live with the one who had broken their vows. This, effectively, ended the marriage as a functioning, cohabiting unit. The guilty party might be ordered to pay support, but the primary relief for the innocent spouse was freedom from the obligation to share a life with someone who had betrayed them so fundamentally. Sometimes, if both spouses had committed adultery, a separation might not be granted, or the situation became more complex. Also, if the innocent spouse forgave the adulterous partner and resumed cohabitation, this was known as condonation, and could nullify their right to seek a separation based on that past offense, unless the adultery was repeated. So, while adultery didn't dissolve the marriage tie itself in a way that allowed for a new wedding, it was a powerful reason for the practical termination of a marital relationship. The betrayal of trust and the public scandal could make it impossible for the couple to continue living as husband and wife, leading the church to sanction their living apart. The marriage might still exist on paper, but the shared life was over. Number 1. The Vanishing Act. Lengthy absence or presumed death. Imagine your spouse goes off to war, on a long pilgrimage, or a dangerous sea voyage for trade. Weeks turn into months, months into years, and there's no word. Are they alive? Are they dead? Can you move on? This was a heart-wrenching and legally complex situation in medieval times, and it could lead to the end of a marriage through presumed death, though it was a risky business. If a spouse disappeared and was unheard from for a very long time, often a period like 5 or 7 years, though this varied by local custom and legal interpretation, the remaining spouse might, under certain circumstances, be allowed by ecclesiastical authorities to remarry. This wasn't an annulment based on an impediment. It was a remarriage based on the presumption, not certainty, that the absent spouse had died. The problem was, what if the presumption was wrong? What if the dead spouse, after years of captivity, shipwreck on a remote island, or simply being lost and unable to send word, suddenly reappeared? This was the classic Enoch Arden situation, named after a later poem, but reflecting a timeless dilemma. If the original spouse turned up alive, the second marriage was immediately rendered null and void. The first marriage was, and always had been, valid, as death had not actually occurred to dissolve it. The person who had remarried was then legally bound to return to their original spouse. Any children from the second, now invalid marriage would face questions about their legitimacy. This created huge emotional and social turmoil. Imagine building a new life, perhaps having new children, only to have your long-lost original spouse walk back through the door. Church courts were generally very cautious about granting permission to remarry based on presumed death precisely because of these potential complications. They would require significant efforts to find the missing person, sworn testimonies about their last known whereabouts, and the reasons for believing them dead. For the spouse left behind, the uncertainty was agonizing. They were in a marital limbo. To remain single for years, perhaps decades, awaiting news that might never come, was a difficult prospect, especially if they were young or needed support. Yet, to remarry risked the devastating consequences of the first spouse's return. Soldiers on long campaigns or crusades, sailors, merchants on distant travels, and pilgrims to faraway shrines were particularly susceptible to disappearing for extended periods. Communication was slow and unreliable. A person could easily perish without any record or witness to their death reaching home. So, while not a formal ending based on a legal fault or impediment like the other reasons, lengthy absence leading to a presumed death and a subsequent risky remarriage was a way that the practical reality of a marriage could cease. The original marriage technically only ended if the absent spouse was truly dead. But if they were alive and returned, it was the second marriage that abruptly and definitively ended, often with heartbreaking consequences for all involved. This highlights the immense difficulties medieval people faced when confronted with the vast uncertainties of life, travel, and communication.